This, like for all soldiers, is their life now. Ukraine or death.
Gunshots, screams, bombs, bangs, and a lot of blood. That's what life is all about when war suddenly takes over a territory and shakes it to the core. In the delicate and raw fragment we have just seen, we can witness how the clashes between Ukraine and Russia have affected the daily life of the TERR0R1STS, a group of soldiers who make up a unique category of the Ukrainian militia's air assault forces. And they are the ones who lived through their worst nightmare firsthand. In today's report, we will witness a mission that this group had to face, and it did not end very well. Because, attacked by the Russian army, surrounded and with no way out, the TERR0R1STS were forced to fight a bloody battle of more than 14 hours, where they fought hand-to-hand for territorial position, the recovery of land, and of course their lives, and those of thousands of Ukrainian civilians. Welcome to this new episode where we will witness a true war miracle. Let's begin. June 2024. It's been 2 years since Russia and Ukraine have been fighting hand-to-hand. This invasion, initiated by the Russians on Ukrainian soil, began on February 24, 2022, and constitutes the biggest escalation in the struggle for land and independence in Volodymyr Zelensky's country. These events followed the Euromaidan in 2014, with a series of Ukrainian independence and nationalist demonstrations and riots. These began on November 21, 2013 in Kyiv's Independence Square, where large protests sedimented a unique Ukrainian patriotism. And that's where the seeds of the warriors began to germinate. In 2014, former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych made the sudden decision to suspend the association agreement between the European Union and Ukraine, and instead strengthen ties with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. Behind this decision, there was a strong pressure from Vladimir Putin, which provoked a host of complaints from Ukrainian compatriots who opposed what they considered widespread government corruption, abuse of power, and human rights violations. They longed to keep their homeland independent, without the need to maintain a link with Russia. Hence, the current clashes have such an impact on the lives of simple citizens willing to leave everything for an independent Ukraine, such as the aforementioned TERR0R1STS group. These men are part of a unit of Ukrainian soldiers willing to die for their beloved country. But they are not just a group of brave warriors, but they have a powerful motivation. They fight to defend their territory with tooth and claw. This common objective united them with a sense of loyalty and belonging to the group, which almost makes them a true family. Next, we will hear Sova, a commander of the TERR0R1STS, explain in his own voice what his mission is.
Since we've been stationed here, we've been holding the line, supporting nearby brigades, doing recon, and bracing ourselves for an enemy attack. I expect it'll come early morning, or when it's dark, or maybe during bad weather. No matter when it happens, we'll give them everything we've got.
As for the previous life of these men, it can be said that it was far from the trenches, as they are not what one would expect from a typical Ukrainian frontline soldier. Let's meet the unstereotypical members of this unit. They are Sova, Punk, Morchak, and Albert. Sova is an artist and tattoo artist from Kiev, whose real name is Roma and who is officially a commander. Punk lives up to his name, as he is of course a fan of that style of music. Morchak used to be a sailor and a navigator of Nordic waters. And finally, Albert, who used to work as an IT person. That is, he was the person in charge of creating and managing computer and technological systems. As you can see, none of them had military training. However, the fact of wanting to defend their lands and achieve Ukrainian liberation and independence from Vladimir Putin and his men has encouraged them to put on their military equipment and go to the front line with every weapon they have. After all, the last thing to be lost is hope. They are family. They belong to each other. What's more, they consider themselves to be rebels willing to kill or die for a flag, a land, and a people that represents them. They are part of the TERR0R1STS, soldiers of unique and varied origins who love Ukraine to the core. Here we will see how Punk explains the tactics of the weapons they have, their uses and logistics, but also their setbacks.
An assault rifle isn't much use against anything other than infantry. With the PKM, you can at least engage lightly armored vehicles. Maybe even try to penetrate the rear of a BMP. We've got armor-piercing rounds we captured from the Russians for BMPs, BRDMs, but they won't stop a tank.
We are left with this last sentence. You cannot stop the tanks. It is very important to understand how this group of men, so lethally prepared, could have been crossed by the adversities that we are going to see. The Kefiriki take refuge under a plot of land with an old underground structure covered with cloth and that functions as a home and containment for each of the soldiers. This is position number 1, the shelter. Now the second is the yard, an intermediate terrain where there is a kind of shelter, but which also serves as a runway between the village and its backup places. This is where they take cover behind enemy lines. However, these shelters are not made of steel, so they are easily permeable to enemy attacks. And in fact, it made them an easy target within the vicinity of the village that the Kefiriki wanted to recover. One cold night, this group of soldiers armed to the teeth went out to hunt Russian enemies while the unit of the Black Sea Defense Group, or BSDG, for its acronym in English, stayed in the shelter, the number 1 post, as a backup force. Meanwhile, the Kefiriki ran in the dark, advancing towards the enemy, stalking like predators their prey. At 4 in the morning, the terrifying sounds of the bombs began to roar. The walls of the shelter trembled. The entire structure began to. The ground beneath them began to shake, as did the ground beneath them, which slowly filled with water. But that was only a brief prelude. The trouble had only just begun. One of the soldiers of the Black Sea Defense Group, Gaba, received a radio call from Sova with a message urging them into action. The tanks were on their way.
Нужна твоя поддержка.
Плюс. Куда поддержка? Куда?
Нужна поддержка в плане противотанковых. Нужна поддержка в плане противотанковых.
In this very fragment, the fear of an attack became a tangible reality. The confrontation was imminent. The enemy troops were arriving with heavy artillery, and they, the Kefiriki, could not hold them off for long. After the call for help, Sova left a clear message to the BSDG soldiers. The enemy troops were coming to attack brutally. Thus, the Kefiriki were hit hard by storms, a type of assault on Russian convoys carried out on the ground to carry out and lower the heads of enemy soldiers. No one was safe. Therefore, while Sova's team tried at all costs to resist the arrival of the tanks, Gaba and his team prepared an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade. Equipped with all this, the BSDG went out to hunt Russian enemies in order to help and rescue their friends, the Kefiriki. In the following fragment, you will be able to witness this terrible confrontation. Everything was chaos. In the absolute solitude of the night, these men went out to face their powerful enemies with only one objective: to reach the next combat position and help their comrades. Despite the fact that they were running out of ammunition and the disadvantage that this implied, Gaba and his men went out with courage, moved by that impulse, and started firing.
Last hope.
With little ammunition but a lot of will, the BSDG group managed to meet up with Sova and his men in combat. Together and more than brothers, these soldiers set out to hunt down the Russian enemies. The only way out of this situation was through open terrain where the crossfire would be the brutal protagonist. Screams, insults, confusion, and darkness. This was the setting for the hard night they would have to face. Next, we will see the precise moment when these men give one last great fight to their enemies.
Малыш, малыш, сова. Малыш, малыш. Супер. Малыш, малыш.
The fight never had a moment of rest, neither did the men, and each fought a battle like no other. In this clip, we'll see how Punk started the shooting while Sova took his grenade, and with strategy began a powerful counteroffensive.
У меня легкая в руку, сова. Легкая.
Then he's injured.
Все будет хорошо, пацаны. Я вас люблю.
Despite the physical consequences, there was a fighting spirit that was never lost. They were brothers in war. After several hours of this battle in front of enemy lines, the day came, and what was previously hidden now became clear and evident. Each of the Ukrainian soldiers, with admirable calm, knew how to understand the game of war and planned their survival strategies. By morning, the shots and grenades had decreased considerably, and while a leader looked after the rear, the other warriors could rest, hydrate, reflect on the steps to follow, and rearm themselves. Only one of the men was wounded. He had lost his hearing because of the incessant roar of the bombings, but even so, his head had to be cool because they still had one more feat to accomplish. Behind enemy lines, 3 tanks and various threats were approaching, and when everything seemed to be calm, a burst of gas surrounded them, anticipating what would come next. A more severe attack and certainly much worse. This was not over. By mid-morning and covered under El Refugio or La Yarda, hiding places 1 and 2 respectively, the KFOR and the BSDG had to activate their defense lines, and thus be able to fight their Russian enemies who with tanks were ready to go for everything. So much so that they had blocked the roads to position themselves in front of the Ukrainian soldiers, and thus enclosed them more and more, without remorse or mercy. Now, shielded on the same ground of 2 opposing houses, the Russians and Ukrainians fought in a shootout like no other. And while the KFOR and the BSDG tried to coordinate drone units and call for reinforcements by radio, no soldier was nearby to come to their aid. However, after a tough battle where bullets and ammunition were heard until exhaustion, a friendly unit with a battle drone dropped an explosive that fell on the Russian lines. Thus, their enemies began to fall, wounded and without strength. The Ukrainian counterattack had been successful, but it did not mean the end of the battle. The Russians continued to outgun them. The tension increased, and while some soldiers were hurt, others were ready for the fiercest of reprisals. In this clip, we will see the last call for help that Gaba requested.
Малыш, ебаните в нас. У нас есть дохуя пидоров. Перекличку, сука, делают. Ебаните в нас, кто слышит?
Gaba sends a final call for help over the radio.
The Russian soldiers were attacking hard, and Gaba and his men had nowhere to run. But hope was not lost. This last call for help had been heard, and the cavalry had landed. More Ukrainian soldiers arrived with heavy artillery, drones, mortars, and rocket launchers. Reinforcements had arrived from behind the uninhabited and vacant lands, ready to fight any Russian shooter they found in their path. The defense was grandiloquent, and the aerial images of the sky mined with rockets were unparalleled. After a hard attack, the village and everything around it was devastated by the incessant flare of rockets that mined the sky. Thus, Gaba and his men were able to go out and counterattack the Russian soldiers with what they had left. Little ammunition, but a lot of thirst for enemy blood. Punk had been wounded after an explosion when he was enveloped in a cloud of dust and shrapnel. However, their transfer was successful. Anyway, at the shelter and already nearing nightfall, the fire began to stalk the house where they were staying, and by sunset, the KFOR and the BSDG were forced to go out and run for their lives. There were no enemies in sight, only fire and darkness. All thanks to the support of 2 other soldiers who had managed to block and kill the Russians. Once they found shelter, they managed to understand that they had just survived an unprecedented attack in the history of the Ukrainian militia. Although the tough fighting lasted 14 long hours, the rescues were possible thanks to the reinforcements and heavy artillery of these rebellious soldiers. They, more than anyone else, carried the weight of the weapons on their shoulders. Thus, the KFOR and BSDG, whose dreams, now more than ever, are of war and pride for the Ukrainian motherland, became legends. This is how we come to the end of the report. If you like our content, please give it a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to keep up to date with our stories. This is Military Force. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time.